I'm going to go ahead and get started. I always have more slides than I seem to have time, so I'm going to try to really stay on target today. Everybody hear me all right? Okay. My name is Stephanie Tanguay. I am began my career as an occupational therapist almost 30 years ago. I worked as an OT in the U.S. A lot of that time with consumers with spinal cord injury. Spent a lot of about 6 years working in an interdisciplinary seating clinic in the U.S. and also worked as a dealer, if I'm using the right term for here. And I did that for about 7 years. For the last, I'll be having my 9-year anniversary in July as the clinical education specialist for a company called Motion Concepts based out of Toronto in Canada. I cover primarily the United States, but every year or every other year I get to do some international travel. So I've been enjoying my first trip to the beautiful country of Australia. So I appreciate the hospitality that I've been shown. It's been quite nice. The reminder for everybody. So I was really trying to make this be a truly more educational time rather than a sales pitch time, which is what we were asked to do. So the vast majority of this is some very more of a basic review of some principles with seating and concepts. So I'm presuming that many of you that are attending are involved in the wheelchair prescription process. Is that a fair assumption? So you might find this helpful, or maybe just helpful as a review. It seems that a lot of times our prescription, one of the things that's been fascinating for me to learn this week is that some of you are dealing with a scenario where from your prescription process to when your consumers are receiving their equipment can be maybe 6, 8, 10, or 12 months, or maybe even longer in some scenarios. And we deal with that quite often in North America as well. Both the U.S. and Canada sometimes can have these large windows between when we are making our recommendations. So it's an interesting problem to realize that we are all sharing, and I think it's also detrimental sometimes for our consumer, because in that gap, sometimes they can change quite a bit, and also the equipment, they may be using a rental or a loaner piece of equipment. Maybe there's an organization that might give them something, but it might not be a good fit. It might not be the best support, and then there's always the risk for the temporary equipment to actually cause more orthopedic problems and changes that you didn't account for at your prescription process. So we're all struggle, I think, with some very similar types of scenarios that are quite problematic. And as I'm sure many of you realize, that the creation of a pressure sore or an orthopedic change, that can be quite detrimental and makes our next provision of equipment more costly very often. So it's just not a great problem to have, but something that we all share. So it's been kind of interesting for me to learn. So, and I certainly know this because I started my career working with consumers with spinal cord injuries. Always at the top of my list in my prescription for appropriate seating is the concern for pressure. As I've traveled around the world, most therapists I meet this is very, very high, if not the number one, usually in the top 3 goals that we have for our seating selection. We want to try to assure that we're going to prevent or do whatever we can to prevent the creation or the occurrence of a pressure sore from the seat surface. Sometimes our healthcare systems don't always make this an easy thing to do, to be preventative or proactive. I know in the U.S. market we struggle with this because sometimes our funding wants us to wait until the consumer presents with a wound issue before they want to use the highest tier of cushion. And it seems self-defeating because we could spend a few $100s more perhaps for a better cushion and prevent thousands of dollars worth of issues with maybe surgeries, hospitalizations, and such. So it's very frustrating. I usually would say to people I was never, did not like physics at all, but the one concept that I have to embrace in my career is the concept of the physics concept of pressure. So where we have for pressure reduction, what we're really looking for is pressure equals the is equal to the force over area. And so we are also looking at distributing our consumers' weight over as much surface contact as possible to use that maximum area to distribute their weight as much as we can and reduce the overall direct seat contact pressures. Also, just orthopedically, if you think about the body, I think we sometimes forget that our largest muscle in our pelvis area, the gluteal tissue, in standing is in an ideal place for weight bearing, but it doesn't stay there when we move into a seated position. With the hip flexion, a lot of the gluteal tissue mass actually rotates laterally, and so we don't always have the most available weight support surface for the seated position. So because of that, it puts our ischial tuberosities at significant risk for the consumer who is seated during the course of the day. Perhaps consumers that are unable to ever stand or alter their orientation for mobility. And so with that concept, as that large tissue mass moves up, significantly higher risk. And also, and I'll point this out in a couple of the subsequent slides, but many of the cushions that you will see in the stands at the show today, the higher level products usually have some amount of contouring, and that is really designed from the manufacturing end to try to distribute that, to provide that surface contact pressure, but it's also usually a design that is counting on the pelvis to be neutral or only slightly within a posterior-anterior range, not excessively posteriorly rotated, where the ischials actually tend to roll up and displace and forcing our surface to our contact surface to be the coccyx and the sacrum. And so what really makes many of our cushions that we have available commercially actually function properly is not just a great cushion, but also providing good posterior pelvic support and stability. So the combination maybe of a back that can also stabilize at the PSIS and maybe a little bit above, and that helps maintain the orientation of the pelvis. So there's actually, I know this is very old referencing as far as research goes, but it's interesting in our industry that there are a lot of presumptions that we just have, we don't tend to revalidate studies like this back from the 80s. This is pretty much a presumption within our industry now that numerous studies that were done very, very early on were able to show that the pressure distribution would be more appropriate and more optimal when there was support and stability for the lumbosacral spine. And so it's kind of like a given. Usually we like to reference studies that are 5 to 10 years only in age from the date of presentation. But this is really a presumption across the board in our industry. So just to keep in mind, as clinicians, when you think about your cushion selection, there are usually, this may certainly be reordered, but there's usually a few things that will be high on your criteria list. If you're doing prescription, especially for applications in ultra lightweight manual wheelchairs, looking at weight overall of the equipment becomes paramount. We don't want to, when you are doing all of this documentation that I've been hearing about to try to secure funding for an ultra lightweight chair, you do not want to put 15 pounds of seating on that between a back and a seat cushion. And so sometimes weight is the optimal thing. Finding the lightest weight products might be the key. Stability for the consumer, and really in the stability of the seating system is where we can really see the greatest ability for many of our consumers to be optimally functional. from their chair level, and that can be in propulsion, in seated stability for things like transfers, for activities where there's no upper extremity support. Having that stability from the seat and back surface really is what optimizes that. Sometimes your decision making may jump to something like care, maintenance. What has to be done in order to be sure that the cushion or the back support or both are fitted or optimally adjusted? Is it an inflation? Is it a material that might change with temperature? Is it something that has to be daily or several times throughout the day adjusted, checked, or modified? Can your patient or your consumer do that themselves? Are they dependent on their caregivers doing that? And how reliable are the caregivers? And I have learned, I think you guys have the same issue. I have a lot of the consumers that I've worked with who, when they're discharged from hospital, we do a lot of occupational therapy and physiotherapy and nursing training and instruction with the caregivers. And in some of those scenarios, especially if the consumer is paying for some assistance, it seems like within a very short number of maybe weeks or months, sometimes everybody that was trained by the staff is all gone, and there's all new people that were never trained by the rehab staff. So it can be always our goal for the consumers to be able to direct and independently instruct on all of their care. But a lot of times the equipment use and maintenance does not always get conveyed. And what I've also learned, I participated in presenting a study that was done as a survey with clinicians in the U.S. several years ago on how we instructed different aspects of care like pressure relief. And what we found is that most OTs and PTs respondents said that their number one way of instructing a consumer in the proper performance of pressure relief was in verbal instruction, not in a video or photos or written instructions. It was primarily the number one thing that we all tended to do was verbally instruct. And there has to be a way of having that be better documented and continued to be reinforced with our caregivers and with the consumers. So it's kind of interesting. Even sometimes their family members don't remember aspects of chair maintenance and things. So it's quite tough. So it kind of makes me kind of rethink about how I teach about things like equipment. So I'd mentioned the temperature and climate. Size, shape, and weight appropriate, that is not nearly the issue that it was 29 years ago when I got out of university and got my first job. Thankfully, we have many more not only options of different types of equipment and cushions, but now if you need a cushion that is 20, and I apologize, I'm not great with the metric system, so 20 inches wide or 24 inches wide for a heavier consumer, the chance is that the cushion will have a weight capacity that is adequate for the size. When I got out of university, we would frequently have cushions that were 20, or maybe we could find a 22-inch wide cushion, but it still had only a 250-pound weight capacity. And so we saw a lot of things were wider size, but not for the heavier weights. So I think the benefit now is for us that we, as the population in the developed countries have gotten a little bit heavier, and we're very heavy in the U.S. We have a lot of issues with the bariatric needs in the U.S. market. And other places in the world too, but we've definitely seen manufacturers step up and make things that are more appropriate. And our wheelchairs also have better weight capacities to meet those needs as well. So that's one great plus, I think, for everybody. And then cushion selections where our cushion might be modifiable. And I think that, as I mentioned when we were first coming in, that can be the key sometimes. If you do a prescription for a piece of equipment today, and your consumer might not receive that equipment until January of next year, the incidence of they may not present now with something like a pelvic obliquity, but 10 months from now, 12 months from now, they may have an obliquity, they may have a scoliosis. So if you picked a component for a cushion where you could add in and build up and maybe act on a hopefully flexible type of an obliquity where we could adjust that and still have the equipment be appropriate, and still meet the needs, rather than have something that is quite static. And now we have to go back in my country. We would have to go back to the beginning and say this is no longer adequate and explain why. Even though it might be because there was this huge gap. So always having things that are adjustable and modifiable are definitely seen as the advantage because of that. So this is actually kind of a list of things that where I've asked therapists over the years, what is your expectation, what the cushion should do? And pressure distribution, proper positioning of the pelvis and the femurs. These are all quite common things, and that most manufacturers build to or design to. Adjustable, as I just mentioned, meeting warranty expectations. So does the cushion have a 2-year warranty, a 3-year warranty? Many of the chairs that we see available now, especially our higher level rehab ultra lightweight chairs, some of them have lifetime warranties, even on the frames, which is great. My fear is, and I'm starting to hear some rumbling now, we have an expectation of a manual chair lasting for 5 years. And now we have some insurance funding agencies saying, well, if the chair can last for 5 years, we want the cushion to last for 5 years. It's quite unrealistic expectation, I think, when we have some people that sit for 10, 12 plus hours a day, 365 days out of the year. If I did that on my sofa, I think my sofa cushion would be like this. So, but we'll see. We see what happens with that. Anyway, lightweight and durable tends, and then the cover. And the covers are definitely the part of most cushions that take a lot of the wear and tear and don't tend to last. So the cushion itself and the hybrids that use different types of foams or bases and fluids or airs, the integral part of the base of the product usually will last for a lot longer than the cover technologies. Unfortunately, a lot of the consumers, especially that I've worked with, do not have good adequate funding to always get a new cover or a second cover, which is very difficult. And so many consumers use their cushions without covers, or you guys may see, I see a lot of people stuff their cushion into like a pillowcase, something like that, or an old cover. Everybody has the same problems. All the heads are nodding. But we have to be careful also. Sometimes the cover is designed with certain things that allow the cushion to really function. So there may be different types of foams or material selections that are integrated. So if the cover fails, the only way to really have the full use of the cushion is to replace it with the same type of cover, or you lose some of your pressure distribution or positioning. So it can be kind of tough. And not to be redundant, so I kind of mentioned all of these, so because I'm kind of watching my timer to make sure I hit this. So many of the cushions that are used in the market now will have at least some aspect of it will be foam. If we could go back 40, 50 years ago, most of what was available 50 years ago across the world was really foam constructed products. In many markets, I still visit 2 of our veterans hospitals in the United States, where they still, for some of their patients, will get out the file with all of the instructions and cut different, so many inches, a ½ inch of this type of foam and an inch of that, and glue it all together and custom sew a cover, and Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so goes home with that cushion, and if they need 2 a year, they go back to the hospital and they make it. The lack of efficiency of that is quite cumbersome. And so we don't really see that. But 40, 50 years ago, many people, that's what they were doing. There are even some hospitals that I have visited where if the patients could, part of their occupational therapy was actually helping in the construction of their cushion that they would utilize. So the great thing about foam, though, it offers us a lot of benefits. It is some of our lightest weight materials that we have to use are indeed foam. Foam tends to provide a lot of support and stability for the pelvis, and so it really can be very beneficial for the consumer as far as a base medium for those functional activities and stability, maintaining stability, and then also for dynamic activities like transferring. And the other thing that's quite unique now, in the 21st century, the engineering of foams has improved tremendously over the last 40 years or so. Where many companies, we can engineer foams with certain characteristics, where we really want to zero in on that. In our industry, a lot of times, many years ago, what we used to use almost exclusively were things like viscoelastic or memory foams. And memory foams have that soft, slow rebound and the indentation, so it has a modulus that we all like, and you all like to pick up a small piece and pinch and play with that, and little stress balls and things like that. Those soft mediums sometimes can have. We didn't used to have as many varieties of that as we do nowadays, and sometimes what gave it that soft, slow rebound also, those types of foams can sometimes be quite sensitive to heat, where with higher heat or high heat and humidity, we can see those foams collapse more. So very often we're using less and less of the memory foams and more other hybrid or engineered foams that help provide the characteristics that we need. The one thing, and some of the Tempur-Pedic foam, or I shouldn't say that because that's a name brand, but some of the memory foams also can be rather heat retentive, and so other foams that don't hold heat so much are also more beneficial for the consumers. So a couple of things also, foam is used because it tends to be a little bit lower in cost than some other materials. Although different types of foams, we have higher grade and lower grade foams. Some are quite inexpensive and almost break down too rapidly, and so it's always about using a higher grades or higher qualities of materials that will last longer. To really extend the life expectancy of the product. So, as clinicians, part of what falls on your shoulders is to kind of have the opportunity to try different products and kind of gauge what will really be the most consistent over time, knowing how your patient will use that and what's going to really be the most beneficial for the longest course of time for them, the most stable. But open cell foams do tend to be a little bit lower in cost, and they tend to lose their, some of them can lose resiliency quicker. Closed cell foams tend to be a little bit higher cost. They can also lose their resiliency a little bit more slowly, so they tend to be a little bit more stable. There's actually several research projects that I know of that have been going on in the last few years looking at, because all foams will also collapse over time. And so there's been some research that's been going on primarily by Stephen Spriegel's group at Georgia Tech in Georgia in the U.S., where they've been looking at the how much collapse of foam, how much percentage-wise do we have to lose before we start losing the weight distribution characteristics of the foam, because there's a certain degree or percentage of foam collapse where it really does not change the pressure distribution at all. So it's really kind of gauging, and that type of research definitely will help manufacturers in picking and engineering foams that will have the greatest longevity for the consumers and the greatest benefit overall. Because what foam, the lightweight is what's really the lightweight and the stability of foam is really what's the greatest benefit. As you go through the stands on the show, you may notice some characteristics that are quite consistent with the design of different cushions. I really love to I use this slide quite a bit when I talk about seating, because it makes no difference to me what you're looking at as far as what type of cushion that is. What it is about is thinking about cushions in more of a general way, what they provide and don't provide, and what your patient needs, and trying to do that marriage rather than just thinking, oh, this brand or that brand or that brand. So it doesn't sound like a sales pitch at all, does it? So when you look at this, you will have things like a trochanteric shelf. So usually in the posterior aspect of the cushion, on the lateral aspects of the cushion itself, usually a little bit higher, and that is where a cushion is designed to try to support and stabilize the lateral aspects of the pelvis. It is usually a lower contour in the center on the rear, And in this area where the lowest bony prominence, the ischial tuberosities and the coccyx, ideally should fall in that target. Some cushions will be built up, especially adult cushions, will be built up a little bit more about midway, and that's, we sometimes use the term the pre-ischial bar. Some people think of that as a design in a cushion of more of an anti-thrust, but there's usually a buildup at the point where we're trying to maintain position of the pelvis in the rear of the product and not let the pelvis kind of posteriorly rotate and migrate over the bar. And so having the height of a cushion be higher here and lower back here, the idea is that in a seated orientation, the lowest bony prominence in the pelvis are behind that pre-ischial bar and hopefully stay in that orientation. And I'll have another slide where I'll point that out. There will most likely be some degree of ab and adduction contouring to help with femoral alignment. Sometimes you will have an option with some cushions to have greater or like higher ab and adduction contouring or lower, depending on what the consumer needs. I'm sure some of you have worked with consumers who have quite a tendency to sit more abducted and externally rotated, and so you sometimes need a higher contour to help maintain more alignment to the femurs. If we always let the consumer kind of move into that abducted and externally rotated orientation, it's much more likely to see the pelvis kind of posteriorly rotate when that happens and to see the patient migrate forward. So that alignment sometimes at the femurs is really what helps maintain the pelvis orientation into the rear of the cushion. This is a couple of pictures. I shot these about 6 years ago. We had launched a product that was a single density foam with kind of an interesting contour and shape on the bottom. But I love this because it has a little bit more of an aggressive contour. And this is really something that I took these pictures to kind of highlight this. This is really what that design characteristic of having the trochanteric shelf and the lower contour is all about. So if you think about where your ischials fall in that lower dip here, and you can see where the sides, where it kind of is significantly higher, and where that stability would be. So we're always trying to get more weight bearing on the full run of the femurs and on the lateral aspects of the pelvis. And now this is also, I'm presuming that we're talking about a pelvis that is intact, meaning I don't have a dislocated hip or a hemipelvectomy. I mean, standard out-of-the-box cushions with these types of designs are meant for people with an intact orthopedic structure. If you have somebody who has a hemipelvectomy, a hip dislocation that's chronic, this is, the weight-bearing surfaces change quite a bit with that. But for the most part, this is what the vast majority of our contoured cushion top surfaces are designed for. There was a study done by Doug Hobson in the U.S. Back in the, I think, late 70s, where they looked just purely on the contoured foam and a planar piece of foam, exact same type of foam, but the contoured foam was found to have better pressure distribution than the planar foam. And so we have a contoured shape to the buttocks and the pelvis, and that's what's going on the contoured surface, and hopefully that marriage of that contoured surface is similar enough that we dissipate our surface contact pressure just based on the contour. Planar surfaces would work terrific with SpongeBob SquarePants if you're going to put him in a cushion, because we have a flat surface interfaced to a flat top. But that's the only joke I have. I was really hoping. I was really going for the giggle. I'm sorry. So you guys have the movie coming out. I saw an advertisement on the bus. I thought for sure we'd bond over that. So anyway. So also something to keep in mind is the difference of the male and female pelvis. The male pelvis in general has much slightly thinner, more pointy ischial tuberosity formation. Slightly closer together also, the ischial span of the male pelvis, where the female pelvis the ischials themselves are slightly more flat and a little bit more rounded off and slightly farther apart. But for the most part, in an anthropometric average, we can design cushions that really look at the shape of these and come up with a standard variation for an ischial target for a cushion design that will address both of these needs. Obviously, if we're going to talk about pediatric seating, we have a much narrower pelvis overall. But the other thing to keep in mind that's important is that once you're an adult, your IT span is your IT span. And when we have heavier consumers that put on more weight, it is not that their ITs do not suddenly spread out and 3 or 4 inches further apart. There's got to be a few physios in the room, physiotherapists, because they always nod their head and giggle because you guys are thinking about what that gait pattern would look like if suddenly my ischials were an additional 4 inches farther apart. That'd be pretty weird, eh? This also means the shape of the ischial tuberosities. A very thin male with not a lot of with a lot of muscle atrophy and not a lot of that padding that we talked about at the beginning. That consumer is definitely the higher risk for pressure sore development on the ischials. I'm not saying that at the other end, a heavier female patient that has a little bit more padding, probably the lowest risk. Anybody can get a pressure sore, obviously, but in general, the people that we kind of like set the alarms off that we should be very proactive about is going to be our thinner male patients, just because we know that the shape of their ITs is quite at high risk. So, temperature and moisture. Some consumers are much more sensitive for temperature and moisture issues, and this can the retention of a lot of heat in our materials or entrapment of moisture against the skin can really expedite tissue damage. And sometimes cover materials also can really play a role either in dissipating more of that temperature or in retaining it. So be very aware. This is the only gross, disturbing picture I really have in this presentation. And if anyone had told me at university that I would be dealing with these types of consumers, I would have said absolutely no way. I was going to get out of university and be a hand specialist, is what I thought. So who knew? But what was fascinating to me, working with some very good wound care nurses and working with a spinal cord population for years and following patients for years post-injury, is that the shape, the location, and the shape of a wound tells you a lot about how it was formed. And when you look at elongated wounds like this, or sometimes are elongated and more tunneled wounds like you see on the bottom here, a lot of that is not from static pressure. A lot of that is from shifting pressure and shearing that occurs, displacement of the body or a surface against the body. But when you see a wound in the upper right-hand corner, this is a pelvis of a young man that I worked with many years ago in my OT career, who was discharged from an inpatient rehab stay. He was a C5 level complete quadriplegic, was discharged home in a ultra lightweight manual chair in a what would have been considered at the time probably one of the best pressure distribution cushions available in the market. His mother was his only caregiver, so he ended up in a nursing home, a long-term care facility, about a year and a half after his injury. She just could not physically provide all of his care single-handedly. And at that nursing facility, they got him up every day, got him dressed, got him in his chair, and then he sat statically in his chair throughout the course of the day. So for 8-10 hours a day, static pressure. So what you need to realize is that no matter what, in your interpretation, the greatest pressure relief cushion surface could be, if somebody sits statically on that for the course of a day, day after day after day, you can develop a pressure sore on any surface. I'm not saying that the cushion was good or bad. I'm saying it's circumstances. And there's a lot of factors. There's nutrition, but you cannot sit statically on anything. That could happen to anybody. Those are perfectly round right at the ischials. Those are not from bed. Those are not from shear. Those are direct static seated. Stage 4, necrotic, thankfully not osteomyelitis infecting the bone for his sake. So he required surgery, flap surgery, to close both of those. Rather than a manual chair, since that time he has utilized a power chair with a power tilt and space system for independent pressure relief. He's never had a reoccurrence of pressure sores since he received a power chair where he became independent to do as pressure relief. So. I'm gonna skip a little bit here because I am gonna, as I promised, gonna run out of time. But keep in mind about the hot and cold, because different materials that you use, especially closed air chamber systems, can be very sensitive with temperature, and different types of foams as well. Some of them get superheated. Some materials are heat retentive and can cause tissue damage. For cold, I'm from Michigan in the States, so you can have some cold winters, probably a little bit colder than the winters are here. And I'm like, winter, I should pack sweaters? No. I'm in a short sleeve shirt that I never take out of my closet at home in the winter. I always had patients that maybe would leave their cushion in their car at night. It's very detrimental. Sometimes foams freeze, fluids can freeze. So you just have to, but all fluids and foams are not the same. So looking at the different materials and seeing what is the most consistent in the broadest range of temperatures can sometimes be quite important. And altitude, whether consumers flying, or even in some mountainous areas, sometimes a patient may live or cross over a mountain area through an altitude change that can affect especially the closed air chamber products. So it's not a reason to not use them. It's more about education for making sure that they or their caregivers can adjust them properly and monitor them. But you've probably all been on a plane where you have a closed chamber air, like a water bottle. That same thing if you take a soda, a Coke, that you don't open before in a screw top bottle, and you take that up to 20 or 30,000 feet and then open it and watch the explosion occur, because of the pressure on the chamber is different. So we can see that affect our cushions. So anyway, so all of this I had mentioned about positioning the pelvis and maintaining the orientation for the PSIS. These are a couple of pictures on the same thing as skeleton taken on a new cushion that we're actually just introducing last week here for the Australian market, that uses a contoured foam base with a little bit different fluid pad design. But the same type of thing, trying to base this on an average for the ischial span, and this staying consistent across size ranges, and then the lateral shelves or decks that capture and support and stabilize the lateral aspects of the pelvis, to be what gets wider as the cushion gets wider. So always designing with that in mind. So when we have the fluid pad on that, you can see a little bit, it's very much thinner than some of the deeper pads, but always to try to drop the high risk bony prominence into that well. And then also, think about your consumers with their seated position. So sitting is not a static activity. If you have a patient who's able to move forward, anterior and posterior, to rotate, some of our consumers that we work with, they have to transfer they may come to the front of their cushion surface to participate in a certain activity, to reach for something, to transfer safely, and the design of and stability of the cushion, wherever they have to be located on that, can be beneficial or detrimental depending. So you have to watch how that happens. I have worked with a lot of patients who could never do this, but sometimes if you think about that amount of weight shift, sometimes we actually teach our patients to use anterior leaning, and it can be quite effective from a weight shift standpoint, but you also have to be able to be stable enough to sit back up. I have a lot of patients that maybe could get there, but could never get themselves back upright. And then there are some times where we have a cushion material that is so unstable that if you got all the way forward, it would actually push you even farther anterior. So if just to know your patients, so that if they're going to do things like this, that you know that we look at a surface that is going to be complementary to how they are going to perform their pressure relief and their different activities. The back support really does become an integral part of our seating system. And so there's been quite a bit of research that's looked at the amount of support and stability that's necessary. A lot of, I think years ago, a lot of our anthropometric measurements for lumbosacral curve, most of those initial measurements were always done with the upright lumbosacral curve, which flattens out, about 2/3 of that flattens out when we move to a seated position. So you don't always need these very thick, prohibitive lumbosacral contours to provide stability. A lot of times for our cushion surface, a small amount of extra stability at the PSIS is really what will help to maintain the pelvis in a most neutral orientation. And so we'll see, I love when the graphics work. Really it's usually about the orientation. A lot of times I see people that are building up lumbo support but go quite high on the spine. And this really needs to be more like at the belt line, if you will, right at the PSIS, where that's where we get our greatest amount of control and stability. I love the little lumbar that drops in here because you'll see how high it comes up. It's really more the shape here of some of like the small portable lumbar pillows that you might see someone who sustains a back injury kind of carry about with them, and maybe use that at their home or at the theater. But sometimes the contour and shape is quite prohibitive, and I always wonder if that is not based more on that the depth of the lumbosacral curve in standing versus what it really needs to be for sitting, because you don't tend to need nearly the thickness that we have with a lot of our aftermarket products. This is really the transition that tends to happen when we don't provide this. So if you could imagine, I'll check my time, so 40 minutes ago when you all came in here, if you would come in and none of these chairs, what if it was like bleachers with no back support? And how difficult would that be to sit and listen to me speak for 45 minutes with no back support? It would be terrible, right? So that many times we will be looking at working with a consumer who they may be able to sit forward on their cushion or to sit without support for a short period of time, but none of us could sustain that throughout the course of the day. This is really kind of the transition that happens. And so as we fatigue, as our muscles fatigue, we end up with more of that posterior pelvic rotation, and you can see how that flattens out the lumbosacral spine, and we have the kyphosis that begins throughout the spine. As soon as that happens, as soon as we start sitting posteriorly rotated and collapsed, the physiological changes that are starting to occur, we cannot get full vital lung capacity. You can't get adequate inhalation, full inhalation range when you're here. You also, as soon as we start to become more kyphotic, you sacrifice some of your upper extremity range of motion purely from being in this position. You cannot get full shoulder flexion in that position. And over time, this tends to get more severe. You can see the hyperextension of the cervical neck as the person is trying to still keep their visual field up and engaged in activity. And then over time, and we certainly see this a lot with our more elderly patients who sit sometimes very collapsed and kyphotic. It's just too much effort to do this. Might be neck pain issues from doing this too much, and then we begin with the constant collapse. And their visual field, they're not engaged in their environment. Their visual field is maybe the floor, their knees, or their feet, and that is really it. And it's very difficult for them. Not to mention, so respiratory compromise, circulatory compromise, and swallowing issues that can all occur with this type of posturing because they're not helped to maintain a more functional orientation. So. At the same time, I see a lot of elderly people that sit with this type of an orientation with a fixed kyphosis. So elderly gentleman, he is not going to sit. I can't strap him back and straighten out that spine. So at a certain point, we have to accommodate the fixed deformities and changes orthopedically. One of the things that I like to point out, I see sometimes people take a measurement for a back height to the shoulder. Oh, I need to have a back 22 inches tall. For this gentleman, a back that came up here, he would never come in contact with that. It ends up being this big space that people like to put a pillow in there, right? Stuff a pillow because there's a big gap. So we don't need to do that. Only to support the apex of the curve with a fixed kyphosis. And just very quickly, as I run out of my last minute here, this is just a quick. I just recently got these photos. A physiotherapist friend of mine at home. This is her aunt, who was fairly recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, but she probably has had Parkinson's for quite a bit of time. Ended up with a hospitalization and now really needs to utilize a wheelchair pretty much full-time in the home, and was very common type of a scenario. She was sent home in a loaner chair, so this is not hers that you see on the left, but you can see she's quite a petite woman in a quite wide chair. So, of course, my physiotherapist friend Kate was very distressed because this is way too heavy and wide of a chair for her to mobilize at all. And you can see with the sling upholstery and how wide everything is, so there's a lot of risk for displacement of the pelvis and leaning. And she already has a slight scoliosis already, so she is very concerned between now and when we get something better, what will happen. So she was able to contact a friend who works for a local dealer, say they were family interested in purchasing a more appropriate chair. They actually loaned a smaller, narrower chair, about 16 inches wide to her, and she also wanted to have a better cushion and a better back support. Very often we would utilize only the sling seat and sling back and maybe a very low-end, short-term use cushion. So this is a little bit different type of a cushion. And this back support, it's a rigid back support, but a 10-inch tall. So she's under 5 feet tall. I think she's 4'8". So you can see quite petite to be in that large chair. And I apologize. So I've got these K5. This is we categorize our chairs based on how adjustable and lightweight they are. So a K5 chair would be a very high-end type of a chair, whether it be a folding frame or rigid chair. So they were provided a loaner and then purchasing a even lower weight definitive chair for her to utilize. So she just took some pictures for me comparing the posture in the too large rental or loaner chair and then this. And then I've got a couple of pictures. You can see some of the rotation issues that occur. This is her final chair that the family purchased for her. And so they were able to use the same cushion and better back support that they had on the narrower loaner in her definitive chair. She does use her feet and her hands a little bit for household propulsion, but they have a low seat to floor height, but enough that she can still use the foot supports when they're out in the community. Sometimes I think it's important to remember from a variety, from whether it's cognition or other types of things that can affect, sometimes our consumers do not have the vocabulary or the way to express things like discomfort. Sometimes I think, especially for the nonverbal consumers, their agitation is sometimes really a way of they're agitated because they're uncomfortable. We don't always key into that. For her, she was so uncomfortable on the other thing, but this is definitely better. But what her caregivers are saying that she's not sliding, not displacing, and also not fidgeting so much. And so that was really a significant gain. And they've definitely seen an improvement with her having more stability, having greater abilities for some self-mobilization with the lighter weight, more appropriate size chair and a cushion and back with more stability. So anyway, so I'll stop right there. There's the message for the day. The only funny picture I have for you. So finding the perfect balance point. And that is my email address. So they didn't give me a way of providing handouts for today, but if you would like a copy of the presentation, if you email me, I will be happy to send this to you as a PDF handout in color, so the pictures will make much more sense in color than little black and white blocks. I'm over 50 now, and so if I was doing this, I would need to say, and please, bigger pictures. So if you want the larger size, just say larger pictures, please. I'll be happy to do that for you as well. And I thank you for all your attendance and time and attention. So I'll be right outside in one of the stands right outside here if anybody has any questions, because I want us to move out of the room fairly quickly. And thank you very much. Appreciate it.